Good morning. Yeah, so today is December 18th, hence the Christmas hat, Santa hat, and my little festive sweater here. So today we're going to be talking about the Civil War and Georgia's role in the Civil War. This goes along with standard 8H5B. We're going to be using this PowerPoint here. We're going to skip through this part. If you'll notice here, this is a really great map. This shows you here in the burgundy maroon color. Those are the Confederate states. These states here, they're in light blue. That would be Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, kinda a state, not really a state, kinda a state, Maryland, and Delaware. Those were states that were still in the Union, but were slave states. The rest of these dark blue states, okay, those were Union states and they were free states. All right, so let's move on to the Confederacy. After Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, 7 Southern states seceded from the Union. Lincoln was firmly against the spread of slavery, and Southerners were worried that he would eventually destroy their livelihood. The Southern states formed the Confederate States of America and elected Jefferson Davis as president of the Confederacy. So Lincoln's elected in November. Come December 20th, you have South Carolina becomes the first state to succeed or leave the Union, no longer wants to be a state. They want to create their own country. That country would be called the Confederate States of America. So let's talk about Lincoln for a second. Lincoln's goal was to preserve the Union. He said it time and time again in all his speeches. He asked the Southern states to consider rejoining. He addressed the slavery issue by stating that he would not interfere with the institution of slavery in states where it already existed. So, if you were basically what he's saying is Georgia, if you want to keep your slaves, but we're not going to have any new slave states. However, it was not enough, and the Civil War officially began on April 12, 1861. Photograph of Lincoln. You can see he was a tall, skinny fellow. We start off with an anaconda plan. Now, anaconda is a giant snake, and it's a giant snake that takes its prey and squeezes them until they can't breathe anymore. That was the plan. President Lincoln did not want a long and costly war. He worked with General Whitfield to create a plan that would hurt the South's trade and crush its economy. Lincoln announced the Anaconda Plan on April 19, 1861. There were two parts to the plan: blockading southern ports, so not allowing any boats, any ships in or out of the southern ports, and then seizing key locations along the Mississippi River. This is what it looked like. So basically, big snake wrapped around the South, squeeze in on it, and not allowed any trade. So that was an effect on the economy. During this time period, cotton was crucial to the South's economy, and the region relied on cotton sales domestically and internationally. The blockade tactic would prevent the South from selling cotton and other goods to European countries. It also stopped other countries from sending weapons and supplies to the South. Union battleship off of Georgia's coast. Union leaders set up a blockade of southern ports in order to cut off Confederate commerce and weaken the South. Over 500 Union ships lined the southern coast, preventing all people and resources from entering or exiting to the Atlantic Ocean. Occasionally, Confederate blockade runners snuck through and were able to make it to Europe to trade for supplies. In April of 1862, Union soldiers landed on Tybee Island and captured Fort Pulaski, the fort that was protecting Savannah. Once the brick fort was obliterated means literally it was destroyed and kind of blown to pieces. The fort is actually still there. You can go visit as you head onto Tybee Island, and you can still see where they shot it with cannons for about 36 hours straight. The North was able to blockade the important port of Savannah. Hardly any Confederate ships could make it in or out of Georgia. Now, this is going to be important, this April 1862 date. So that's basically when Savannah fell into Union control. It's no longer controlled by the Confederate Army or the Confederate Navy. The coastal blockade allowed the Union to destroy important forts and port cities like Savannah throughout the South. There's a drawing that shows the bombardment of the fort. There's a photograph of the fort. Now, like I said, you can go there and visit it, and you can still see that same destruction there. Move me over here. Despite blocking trade and supplies from reaching the Confederacy, the Union's war strategy was not as successful as Lincoln had hoped. He decided to change the Union's battle plan by taking the focus off the Confederate states. After a somewhat successful Union victory at the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln took the opportunity to issue a proclamation that would change the course of the war. That proclamation is known as the Emancipation Proclamation. So that's this big word right here, emancipation. President Lincoln issued the Emancipation, means basically, I'm freeing you proclamation. You are free to go. On September 22nd, 1862, however, he gave states a time period in which to comply and surrender and rejoin the Union. So it actually didn't take effect until January 1st of 1863. This was an executive order by the president, and it declared that all persons held as slaves in certain designated states. So what that means is like that map I showed you earlier of Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, they were slaves in those states. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free those slaves. It only freed the slaves that were in the Confederate states. All right, so keep that in mind. Didn't free all slaves. That would not come about until the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. This document, the Emancipation Proclamation, would shift the focus of the war from preserving the Union to freeing enslaved people of the South. And that is really what changed people's attitudes and gained support. Freedom to slaves. For Southerners, the Emancipation Proclamation was final proof that the North would destroy the Southern way of life. Northern abolitionists saw the emancipation of slaves as a great victory and now had a valuable reason to fight. With the proclamation, President Lincoln made it clear that the Union's purpose was now to fight for the freedom of enslaved people, not just to save the Union. Because nobody really cared if Georgia was a part of the Union or not, but they did care about freeing the people who were enslaved here. An additional component to the Emancipation Proclamation was that Black Americans could enlist in the Union Army. Over 180,000 Black Americans enlisted and fought bravely, aware of the great risk if they were captured by the Confederate soldiers. An estimated 3,500 Black Georgians joined the Union against the Confederates. About 600 of them were right here in Dalton at what is now called Fort Hill School. All right, it's right there off downtown Dalton, just off of Glenwood Avenue. Big school up on top of the hill. That was an Army fort, had about 600 African-American soldiers there at the end of the war. Okay, show some of the folks who joined. Atlanta. After big victories in Vicksburg, which is in Mississippi, and Gettysburg, which is in Virginia, the war began to turn in favor of the Union. President Lincoln knew that there were still key Confederate locations in the South. Gettysburg is actually in Pennsylvania. So he focused the Union's next move on the railroad hub city of Atlanta. So you got to remember, Atlanta spent a lot of money building all these railroads. Supplies were still coming in and out of Atlanta. The Union troops began to push towards Atlanta and soon celebrated a win against Confederate troops in the railroad center of Chattanooga, Tennessee. This would be the Battle of Chickamauga. 58,000 Union troops marched south into Georgia on September 18th of 1863 and were met by 66,000 Confederate soldiers near Chickamauga Creek. That's a lot of men fighting all at one time. The battle that occurred in Chickamauga lasted 3 days and is considered the second bloodiest battle of the entire war. 16,000 men were killed. Union troops were forced to retreat to Chattanooga, and thus became the largest Union defeat in the war. The Union may have lost the Battle of Chickamauga, but the war was not over. This is the battle above the clouds. Then General Sherman, William T. Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman was placed in charge of Union troops, and he began another campaign to Atlanta to capture the city of Atlanta. Sherman first tried to take the Western Atlantic Railroad's major supply lines for the Confederacy in Kennesaw. That is after he had taken Dalton. Okay, so he was following the rail line from Dalton down to Kennesaw. But his troops were defeated in the battle. The loss did not stop Sherman, and he continued to move towards the city of Atlanta. Here's a picture right there. Okay, General Sherman. Sherman's troops made their way through North Georgia, leaving a path of chaos and destruction. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston, who had his headquarters here in Dalton, Georgia, was to keep Sherman away from Atlanta so that the South could continue accessing supplies via the railroads. Sherman did something that you weren't supposed to do. He split his troops into 3 sections and surrounded Johnston's army in Atlanta. Sherman set up cannons around the city and blasted Atlanta with cannon fire for over a month. Johnston's troops were not budging, so Sherman set up a trap. He left a few troops behind to continue the siege on Atlanta while most of his army headed south towards Jonesboro. Johnston fell for this and sent his troops after Sherman. He thought Sherman was moving on, headed south. He was not. It was a trap. Sherman sent some of his men back to attack Johnston's troops from behind. The Confederate soldiers were trapped and could not retreat back into Atlanta. September 2nd, 1864, Sherman finally took Atlanta, and to ensure that it would no longer be useful to the Confederacy, his army burned the city to the ground. Sherman's troops burned down over 3,000 buildings in Atlanta, destroying 30% of the city and all of its railroad infrastructure. This is a picture of downtown Peachtree Street. That's what most of it looked like. You can see bombed out, burned out buildings. This was the train house there, completely destroyed. He then begins his march to the sea. General Sherman split his army into 2 and continued his march to the sea from Atlanta to Savannah. Sherman instructed the soldiers to destroy any towns, factories, cotton mills, railroads, and plantations along the way. The purpose of this total warfare tactic was to totally incapacitate or take away the South's ability to supply itself, okay? So that it could not recuperate or could not recover economically and eventually try to fight back. He was taking away their ability to fight and supply themselves. The path of destruction that Sherman's troops left behind was 60 miles wide and nearly 300 miles long. 60 miles wide, 300 miles from Atlanta to Savannah. Total destruction. They destroyed everything that was in their path along their way. Railroads, okay? Now, you got to remember, that was also how Sherman was going to get his supplies, was through these railroads. Not going to happen now because no train can travel that way. Sherman's march cut Confederate supply lines as well as his own and crushed the spirit of the Confederate Army. Half of Sherman's army marched to Decatur, Covington, Eatonton, Milledgeville, while the other half traveled through Jonesboro and Gordon. The 2 groups met in Sandersville and headed on to Savannah. Once Sherman's army reached Savannah, the city immediately surrendered, wanting to avoid the same fate as Atlanta. So remember this, guys. This is in 1864, all right? December of 1864. What had happened in 1862? 1862, Fort Pulaski had fallen, been captured. The city of Savannah and the port itself had been under the control of the Union Army and the Union Navy for the last 2 years. So it was an easy negotiation for the mayor of Savannah to not be destroyed. That's the reason why you still have all the beautiful homes and everything there in Savannah. This is a map of the route that was taken. As you can see, from Chattanooga to Dalton to Resaca to Kennesaw to Atlanta, Milledgeville, straight into Savannah. Then he turns north, runs into Johnston again in Columbia, South Carolina, moves back forward. Union troops captured Savannah on December 22nd, 1864. Sherman presented the city of Savannah to Abraham Lincoln as a Christmas present. From Savannah, Sherman began to the Carolinas campaign and chased Johnston's army throughout South and North Carolina. On April 26, 1865, the Confederates finally surrendered and officially ended the Civil War. Lots of bad stuff happened, though. One is Andersonville. One of the most notorious sites of the Civil War was the Confederate prison camp in Andersonville, Georgia, that held Union prisoners. The capacity of prisoners in the camp was 10,000, but they had over 30,000 men in there during its peak use. Now, guys, all this, it had only one source of water for 30,000 people. It was a creek. It was used by all the prisoners. Everybody got sick. All they did was take this big field and build a fence around it. That's all they did. All right? It was pretty harsh. Supplies, because they had cut off all the supplies coming from Atlanta further south where Andersonville was, they couldn't get any food. And that's what the commander had said. Hey, you cut off my supplies. Well, at the time, if he didn't have supplies to take care of his soldiers, he was actually supposed to, or his prisoners, he was actually supposed to release those prisoners. He did not. So the Union blockade of Georgia's ports caused the prisons to be low on supplies. Once the railroad lines were destroyed, there were even less supplies available to the prisoners. Prisoners liked life necessities inside Andersonville's walls. Shows you some of the camps. Prisoners lived outside with few clothes and had to construct their own shelters made from sticks and cloth scraps and mud. Living conditions were terrible. The prison was overcrowded and unsanitary, and over 13,000 of the captives died of disease and starvation. The camp had the highest death rate of any Civil War prison. After the war, the Union executed the prison's commander, Major Henry Wirz. Wirz was the only Confederate officer who was executed for any types of war crimes by the Union. Picture of the prisoners. So here's what you're to do. You are to create a timeline of the important events that occurred. Well, that says World War I. This is supposed to be for the Civil War. Okay? So they just had a typo there. So from this timeline right here, tell me about the Atlanta campaign. That's September 2nd, 1864. Tell me about the March to the Sea ends in December 22nd, 1864. Andersonville is freed in February of 1864, and then the Civil War ends in April of 1865. So go through that timeline there. More timeline. So this goes backwards. So here's the beginning of the war. Give some details there. The Emancipation Proclamation here. The Anaconda Plan that was implemented here. And then the Battle of Chickamauga here. Okay? Sound good? All right. So hopefully that works. If you have any questions, just send me an email.